Good morning, class. How are you today? Are you doing great? Are you doing fine? Okay, very good. Now, before anything else, let us start our day with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Good morning once again, class. I am Teacher Arley, your class teacher for today. Now, are we all set? Okay, then let us start our first activity. Now, for this activity, as you can see in the presentation, I have posted a quote coming from the movie General Luna. Now, what I want you to do is to ponder upon this quote on what is General Luna trying to say, in which he says, negosyo o kalayaan, bayan o sarili, pumili ka. Now, what is your thoughts about this? Can you share it to the class? Okay. Do we have any volunteers? Okay, then let me call on Miss Rosales to answer or share her idea about this quote. Okay, very good. Very well said, Miss Rosales. Your ideas was very relatable, as it really comes from the heart of a true Filipino. Your ideas really reflects the values of patriotism and love of country to our very own homeland, our country, the Philippines. So, kudos to that, Miss Rosales. Now, let us give her 5 claps for that. Now that the class has already an idea, or their thoughts are already filled with patriotism and love of country, now I have a personal question that I would like to ask to everyone. In which, diba, earlier, we talked about, or I've asked you questions about the past, in which is, it was the quote coming from General Luna. Now, let us hear your opinions about the future of our country. Now, I want to test your knowledge about the current issues that is happening right now in our country. So, given the heated situation among countries like Russia and Ukraine, the U.S., the North Korea, so here in our country, the Philippines, there's also a tension between the Philippines and the China. It was also about the West Philippine Sea. The issue is about the kanang pinag-aagawan na territory in Tagalog, or in Bisaya, the territory, the West Philippine Sea is gikaguptan siya kung kinsay tag-iya na iyang. So, it's the China ba or the Philippines. Now, assuming any possibilities will happen, because we don't know the future. Okay, so if another invasion will happen here in our country, or possible the World War III will strike, and the Philippines needs your help, or especially to the younger generations, would you be willing to volunteer and sacrifice yourself to join and fight for your country? And why? Okay, so it's not like mo join sa war. Mahimo kang soldier dayon. So what I mean is, volunteer, become an aide, or mag-nurse ba ka, or mo help ka sa kanang pagpa-evacuate sa mga kuan about ana, dili lang kay mo motago ka, magsalig ka sa uban nga kanang nga ikaw may luwason, but instead mo join ka, mo participate ka sa pagluwas sa atuang country. So that's what I'm trying to say. Okay, so would you be willing to fight? And why? Okay, so let us hear from Miss Hanime Shane Alipio. Alright, Miss Alipio, that was a very I can say, a heartwarming answer coming from you. It really shows how willing you are to participate and fight in the salvation of our country. But because we don't know what will happen in the future, right? Though it's just an assumption, but let's not hope for it though. Fingers crossed. So for Miss Alipio, your answers clearly shows patriotism and love of country to your fellow men, the Filipinos, and in which these values of patriotism and love of country is acquired by our Filipino soldiers from before, who are willing to fight for our country against the invaders, against the oppressors. Even if they lack in resources and expertise in fighting, they really stood bravely to fight for our country against these men. Now, if you may ask, who are these oppressors or invaders who have caused troubles here in our country? So now, let us find out who are these people, the oppressors, as I discussed to you the lesson for today, which is all about the battle against the oppressors. Okay, so before anything else, let us first know or define what is the meaning of the word oppressor. So if we say oppressor, this is any authority or people who uses its power to keep the people under his control. So when we mean oppressors, it is also similar to the words like dictator, tyrant, bully, or torturers. Now, do you have an idea who are these people? Okay, so the oppressors who used to bully our country, the Philippines, are the Americans and the Japanese people. Now, let us talk about first what had happened during the Battle of the Philippines against them, the American and the Japanese. So, let us first tackle the battle between the Philippines and the American forces.
Good morning, class. I'm Teacher Sid, and today we will discuss the battle against the oppressors. And the first battle that we will tackle about is the Philippine-American War. Philippine-American War. It is the war between the United States and Filipino revolutionaries. It happened on 1899 to 1902. The battle happened in Batangas, Luzon, Mindanao, and Samar. And the United States refuses to leave the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. They also had paid 20 million US dollars to Spain for the islands. So, the Philippine-American War is an insurrection that may be seen as a continuation of the Philippine Revolution against the Spanish rule. So, class, what is an insurrection, man? So, an insurrection is the act of revolting against civil authority or an established government, meaning ni-fight ang Filipinos against the oppressors, which is ang Amerika. So, it began after the United States assumed sovereignty of the Philippines following the defeat of Spain in the Spanish-American War. Emilio Aguinaldo declares independence. So, this time, sad, nag-declare si Emilio Aguinaldo og independence for the country. And next is the war estimates. Filipino forces have 100,000 men, while the U.S. forces have 74,000 men. So, the forces of each country have big difference. As you can see, 100,000 sa Philippines, while 74,000 sa U.S. So now let us know how the battle began. The spark that started the war. Again, as I said earlier, it began after the United States assumed sovereignty of the Philippines. On the night of February 4, 1899, Private Willie G. Grayson shot a Filipino soldier on the corner of Susego and Silencio streets in Santa Mesa, Manila. The Filipino answered with a rifle, and the Philippine-American War was on. So, on the night of February 4, 1899, shooting erupted in the outskirts of Manila. While the fighting was in progress, Aguinaldo issued a proclamation of war against the United States. Anti-imperialist sentiment was strong in the United States, and on February 6, the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty that concluded the Spanish-American War by a single vote. So U.S. reinforcements were immediately sent to the Philippines, and Antonio Luna, the ablest commander among the Filipinos, was given the charge of their military operations, but then Luna was murdered, and on March 31, the rebel capital of Malolos was captured by the U.S. forces. And the Filipino commander of the sector where the firing started was in Malolos, together with the other officers, and they were attending a dance. And Aguinaldo sent an emissary to inform General Otis that the firing on our side the night before had been against my order, he said. But General Otis was arrogant and said that fighting having started must go on the grim and end. And Aguinaldo informed them manjud na wa siya nagsugo ug about sa battle. But then kay mapagmataas man kayo si General Otis, and so instead of stopping the fight, he decided to continue and finish the battle. Next is the war tactics. So the Filipino tactics. Low on ammunition, Aguinaldo abandons conventional warfare. Also resorted to guerrilla warfare. And American tactics was take no prisoners, burning villages, and concentration camps, and also torture. So, unsa ganitong mga torture nga gi-mentioned sa previous na discussions? Okay, it was water cure, katopay man sila water tas tumban ilang tiyan, and another form of torture was beating the victims, and it's really cruel and sad, Jude. Next are the battles that happened during the Philippine-American War, and the first battle is the Battle of Bagbag. The capture of Malolos by MacArthur led by General Luna to retreat farther north of Luzon. He established his headquarters in Kalumpit, the town immediately north of Malolos. So here, he prepared his defenses against the Americans who were pursuing him. Nag-send si General Luna og telegram to General Tomas Mascardo in Guagua asking for reinforcements. But General Mascardo refused, wala siya nisugot. So this angered General Luna and ordered his officers to leave for Guagua to punish Mascardo. He brought with him the artillery units, the cavalry, and the elements of the infantry battalion. The Americans swarmed all over the place and defeated Del Pilar. When General Luna returned to Kalumpit at twilight, the Americans had already captured a large portion of the town. So Luna retreated farther north to Pampanga and made preparations to meet the advancing enemy. Another battle was the Battle of Tirad Pass. While fleeing the Americans, Aguinaldo reached the mountain province. He ordered his trusted General Gregorio del Pilar to remain behind as they continued to advance. Del Pilar was to intercept the Americans who were tracking them. So, after the departure of Aguinaldo, Del Pilar chose to delay the enemy at the Pasong Tirad. So, Pasong Tirad is a narrow pass of 4,500 feet high where he had a good view of the surrounding country. The American troops under Major Peyton marched to pursue Aguinaldo. In the morning of December 2, 1899, Major Peyton and his well-armed men proceeded toward Del Pilar's position. The Filipino troops guarding the narrow pass fired at the Americans, who had no recourse but to retreat. So, kay walan may choice ang Americans, so ni-retreat sila. I mentioned earlier that one of the Filipino tactics was to resort on guerrilla warfare. Here, Filipinos resorted to guerrilla warfare with all its devastating consequences. The major operations of the insurrection were conducted in Luzon and throughout them. So, the U.S. Army was assisted materially by indigenous Macabebe scouts, who had previously served the Spanish regime and then transferred their loyalty to the United States. The organized insurrection effectively ended with the capture of Aguinaldo on March 23, 1901 by U.S. Brigadier General Frederick Funston. So after learning of the location of Aguinaldo's secret headquarters from a captured prisoner, Funston personally led the mission into the mountains of northern Luzon. So he and his officers posed as prisoners of the war, marching under the guards of the column of Macabebe scouts, who also were disguised as rebels. Aguinaldo, who had been expecting reinforcements, welcomed the lead elements of the force only to be stunned by a demand to surrender. So na-shock si Aguinaldo kay instead of tabang ang iyang makuha kay ni-request man siya og backup, ni-surrender na noon siya because enemies ang niabot. So when Funston arrived, Aguinaldo remarked, "Is this not some joke?" before being led back to Manila. So with the surrender of General Malvar, the systematic opposition to American sovereignty was ceased. The case of Macario Sakay, patriots refused to surrender, but at this point, their effect on Americans was negligible because the guerrilla war phase was crushed. Now, the casualties of the war. The human cost of the war was significant. An estimated 20,000 Filipino combatants were killed, and more than 200,000 civilians perished as a result of combat, hunger, and disease. So the deaths from US, they have 4,326 soldiers, mostly from disease. Filipinos have 34,000 soldiers and 200,000 civilians, and the Moro Indians have 10,000 to 20,000 men. Of the 4,300 Americans lost, some 1,500 were killed in action, while nearly twice that number succumbed to disease. So not all they kay namatay because of the battle. Some of them died because of mga sakit and gutom. That because of course that time was a crisis, and Philippines remained an important naval base for US through World War II, and finally the Philippines gained independence on July 4, 1946.
Okay, since the Philippine against the American War has already been discussed, now let us move on to the next one, which is about the Philippines battle against the Japanese forces. Philippines campaign. So Philippines was actually part of the Pacific Theater during World War II, involving the Japanese forces and the Allied power, the United States. So Philippines campaign. So it was actually a campaign to defeat and expel the Imperial Japanese forces occupying the Philippines during World War II. So Pacific Theater. When we say Pacific Theater, this is the waters or the islands of the Pacific Ocean in which the battles mostly occurred in. So Philippines campaign was actually the campaign to defeat the Japanese forces. Pre-World War II, so before World War II has actually happened, General Douglas MacArthur or the United States actually built or organizes bases here or units in the Pacific region, in which it is located here in our country, the Philippines. So these are the Subic Naval Base, which is located in Zambales, and purely more on the ships that is used in war. And the other one is the Clark Air Base, which is located in Pampanga, and which is used for the air attacks. So these two bases in the Philippines was actually used by the American soldiers to serve as their base and military facilities. Okay, so the Philippines was actually the U.S. First line of defense against the Japanese plan for a greater East Asia war during World War II. So imagine the cruelty between the two countries, the U.S. and the Japanese, as the Philippines were put in between and was used as a battleground in the Agawan of territory between the U.S. and the Japanese forces. Okay, now let us move on to the Japanese invasion during 1941 to 1945. So it was about 4 years of Japanese oppression to us Filipinos. So there were actually two remarkable battles that had happened. So the first battle was the fall of the Philippines, in which during 1941 to 1942, in which it is the Japanese conquest of the Philippines. And the second one was the liberation of the Philippines during 1944 to 1945. So it was the Allied campaign between the United States and the Philippines to defeat and expel the Imperial Japanese forces from the Philippines territory and its islands. So the first is the invasion, while on the second it is the redemption, or it was the campaign to retrieve the Philippines from the hands of the Japanese people. First, let us talk about the fall of the Philippines during 1941 to 1942. So on December 8, 1941, the Japanese forces led by General Masaharu Homa began bombing the Clark airfield. So as you can see in the picture, so that was actually the actual photo of the bombing in the Clark airfield. So it was then the start of the Japanese invasion. So but before the Philippines was invaded by the Japanese, so on December 7, 1941, so the Japanese actually launched a surprise aerial attack on the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Then several hours later, the attack also occurred here in the Philippine Islands. So it was General Douglas MacArthur who served as the Field Marshal in the Philippines Army, and he was also the one who planned for the defense of the island against the Japanese forces. So the invasion started with initial aerial bombardments, followed by landings of ground troops in Bataan, and then 2 days later also in Camiguin Islands. So they also attacked the Japanese forces in Vigan and Apari using the USP-17 Flying Fortress. So as a result for that, the hangars, barracks, and warehouses were completely ruined, and many people have actually died because of that. Initial landings. So on December 12, 1941, the Japanese forces arrived in Legazpi. So this is in Albay, in which there it came 2,500 Japanese soldiers. And another attack also occurred in Mindanao during December 20, 1941. So at the same time as the Japanese Air Forces continued bombing the other locations here in the Philippines, it actually destroyed or annihilated most U.S. bases or the U.S. power here in the country. Okay, so on December 22, 1941, the main attack happened in the Lingayen Gulf. So Lingayen Gulf is situated in the Ilocos region. So General Masaharu Homa's Japanese forces was well trained, adequately supplied, and is supported by strong naval and air units, unlike the Filipinos, who's poorly trained and inexperienced. So it's very clear who won the battle or who won the attack at that time in the Lingayen Gulf, so forcing the Filipinos to retreat. So on December 26, 1941, the Manila was declared as an open city to avoid further destruction. So it was actually General Douglas MacArthur who issued a communique saying to spare Manila from the attacks either by air or by ground. So which means no shooting, but then the Japanese had deliberately attacked the civilians, resulting for 40 civilians who were killed and 150 were actually wounded. So by then, the Philippines was occupied in the early 1942 by the Japanese forces. So General Jonathan Wainwright was actually the one who led in defending the northern Luzon with his troops. But many of these Filipino fighters were not well trained and was not equipped well with weapons. So as the Japanese fleet gained in numbers, General Douglas MacArthur, along with the combined U.S. and the Philippine forces defending Luzon, so they actually withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula. Defending Bataan. So General Douglas MacArthur retreated to the island of Corregidor to avoid being captured, while ordering his men to defend Bataan. So due to the lack of support and reinforcement after 3 months of resistance, the U.S. Philippine forces suffered a disastrous defeat in Bataan. Imagine, you're a Filipino, you're very, very willing to fight for your country, but then you lack the resources, the support, the reinforcement, you are not well trained, you're inexperienced, so most likely the Philippines will be defeated because of that. So in continuation, General Douglas MacArthur was actually evacuated from Bataan to Australia before the fall, but he vowed to return to the Philippines with saying his very famous quote. So now, do you remember what is this quote? Do you remember during your previous grades on your history class, what did General MacArthur is famous in saying of? Very good, Miss Carbadilla. It was actually the saying, I shall return. Now, thank you, Miss Carbadilla. The fall of Bataan and the Bataan Death March. So, because of the lack of supplies and reinforcements, so the U.S. Philippine forces couldn't hold enough as they were starving. So on April 9, 1942, Army Major General Edward P. King decided to surrender to the Japanese General Masaharu Homma, in which about 12,000 Americans and 63,000 Filipinos became prisoners of war. So this time, as the other Filipinos were fighting and were captured, so other Filipino armies continued to form resistance and guerrilla units to fight back until the Allies returns. So these Allies are General Douglas MacArthur that we're saying. After the fall of the Bataan, it was then the Bataan Death March. So after the surrender of the U.S. Philippine Army, the Japanese troops divided the prisoners into the groups of 100 and command them to march towards Camp O'Donnell in Tarlac. So it was actually about 65 miles away. Now imagine how far was that. So as the march proceeded up to the highway under the heat of the sun, the Japanese guard shoots or bayoneted anyone who fell, who attempted to escape, and who stopped to quench his thirst, because the men or the prisoners were only given a little amount of water and food during the march, in which these took about 5 days for each group to complete. So overall, it took them around 90 days, and it was said that around 7,000 to 10,000 men were killed in this death march. I can say that the Bataan Death March really shows the oppression of the Japanese forces to the Filipino people. As you can see how cruel their actions was. So also, according to my previous history teacher and my grandfather, there were a lot of oppressions that happened during the Japanese era. So this may not be part of our lesson as we more focus on the battle against the Japanese and the Filipinos, but some of the oppressions that they've actually done to us Filipinos were raping women, killing Filipinos in the most brutal way, such as the bayoneta, using of bayoneta, and this one, the Bataan Death March. Okay, class, do you have any questions or clarifications about the phase 1 of the battle against the Japanese forces? Okay, thank you for your response. Now that we're done to the phase 1 of the battle against the Japanese forces, let us now move on to the second phase, in which the Allied campaign for the liberation of the Philippines, in which these happened in the years 1944 to 1945. On August in 1944, General Douglas MacArthur poised his men to return to the Philippines for a campaign to liberate the country against the Imperial Japanese forces led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, landing in Leyte. So on October 20 in 1944, the campaign started with amphibious landings of the U.S. 6th Division in the islands of Leyte. This was captured by December of 1943. So this is actually a picture of General Douglas MacArthur returning to the Philippines, as you can see in the presentation. So now, General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines. Now, who can guess what he has said this time? Okay. So he said, "I have returned." So the landing of General Douglas MacArthur also became a national spot in Leyte, in which it commemorates the historical landing of the general in the Leyte Gulf. May I ask a volunteer from the class to please read the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So thank you for participating in this class. Okay, so at this time, the war at the sea actually begins. So class, in the recent news published by GMA last June 27, they actually reported a U.S. Navy destroyer that was found in the seas of Samar. So, according to the report, it was actually one of the deepest shipwrecks found in the country. So, according to the news, the ship was actually found as a historical remnant in the Battle of Leyte Gulf during World War II. So, how amazing was that? We're just currently discussing about the Leyte Gulf and the battle during the World War II. And then last month, there were actually a shipwreck found as a remnant. There were many small landings that happened in the different parts of the country. So just like in January in 1945, landings occurred in Lingalingang Gulf. In February, Army units moving to Clark and continued heading towards Manila, as well as in Bataan and Corregidor, were also taken by the U.S. Army from the hands of the Japanese. So, slowly by slowly, the Philippines were taken from the hands of the Japanese forces. The Battle of Manila. So, the battle started from February 3 in 1945 and ended in March 3 in 1945. So, this is the battle between the Philippine and the U.S. forces against the Imperial Japanese forces. So, as you can see, the battle lasted for about a month, in which it resulted for the death of 10,000 or 100,000 civilians. So, as you can see in the picture I've presented, innocent people were actually died in that battle, as well as the city was fully devastated, in which the architectural and cultural heritage were fully destroyed. The liberation of Manila. So after a month of fierce fighting against the Japanese forces, the Manila was officially declared as liberated. So yay! The city of Manila is now free from the Japanese forces. So see the joy among the American soldiers smiling widely in the picture. Battle of Corregidor. So on February 16 to March 2 of 1945. So U.S. amphibious and airborne assaults to retake Corregidor Island started with air and naval bombardment. So apart from Manila, other parts of the Philippines were actually faced a fearful battle against the Japanese forces, in which the Philippines and the U.S. Army succeeded in freeing these islands from the Japanese forces. Japan formally surrendered. So on September 2 of 1945, General Tomoyuki Yamashita and Admiral Dinshichi Okuchi formally surrendered their forces in Camp Janhei in Baguio. So at last, the Philippines is now free from the cruel hands of the Japanese forces, from these oppressors. Now class, so after all the discussions, do you have any questions or further clarifications about our topic or about the lessons for today? Okay, very good. So none so far. So if you don't have any questions, then I'll be the one to ask. So, what do you think is the reason why did the Japanese wanted to invade the Philippines? Okay, class. So the Japanese actually occupied most of the countries here in the Asia-Pacific region, such as Taiwan, Korea, and parts of China. So the Japanese ambition was to conquer Southeast Asia and dominate the Pacific area. So the main goal was to expand their territories. But the U.S. was an obstacle for them, making the Japanese to plan an attack to U.S. bases here in the Pacific, specifically in the Philippines. So another reason why the Japanese wanted to invade the Philippines is because the Philippines provide staging areas and supply bases for the Japanese to control the resource-laden Dutch East Indies. In addition to that, the Philippines also lies 3,000 kilometers away from Japan, bridging lines and supply and communication between Japanese homeland and its occupied territories. So that was one of the reasons why Japanese people or the Japanese forces wanted to invade our country, the Philippines. So now, do you have any questions or clarifications for that? So am I understood, class? Okay, so thank you for listening.
For your activity, create a timeline graphic organizer that details the key events in the Battle of the Philippines against American and Japanese forces. And for the evaluation, in a short bond paper, compose a 3-paragraph reflection based on the guide question, what are the effects of the Philippines battle against American and Japanese oppressors to the Filipino people?